So basically, to get to an astrology of disease, astrological medicine was completely embedded in what we call the traditional medical theory of the 4 elements of disease. This is, when we talk about Hippocratic medicine, this is what we're really talking about. Within this theory of medicine, whenever one of the 4 elements goes out of balance, this can produce a dis-ease. And so that's really what we're looking at when we're looking at the astrology of disease as well. Now, with many of the traditional global medical systems, which is to say far beyond the Western Greek-based system, a disease could be classified as being caused by either an excess or deficiency of something. The list, for example, in Chinese medicine is a little different than the list is in Western medicine, and other types of medicine as practiced around the world had this idea too. Sometimes you have too much, sometimes you have too little, sometimes it's just out of balance. Disease is described in the chart, the nativity, by what are called the morbidity factors. Now, this whole system that I'm talking about does not correspond at all to modern medicine. And this is partly because of what we've started with initially with this slide, which is that the germ theory of disease has become a large component of how modern medicine understands disease. It's not to say there are not other types, but as a basis or a cause, the germ theory has become the prevalence theory of disease. Now, when you talk about the germ theory, what you're talking about, another word for it is pathogens, okay? Because there are disease-causing organisms, whether they're bacteria or viruses, whether they're fungi, whether they're multicellular animals, all of these are possible as pathogens. Now, astrology can talk about these. It's just that during the time period when these astrological ideas were developed, they didn't have microscopes. And so they couldn't see a bacterium. They couldn't see a single cell fungus. They certainly couldn't see viruses. They tended to call pretty much everything that they were treating, if they knew it was an organism, a worm. And yet they could see the effect of it. You could see, for example, mildew, and they could understand that it was alive. They understood there were processes they couldn't see. Spoilage, food spoilage is one of them. That's a pretty good example. Now, because they couldn't specify that this is a tuberculosis bacterium, they had limitations in terms of how they could classify pathogens, but they could always look at symptoms. And in this classical period of time, diseases were understood more as symptom clusters than as a specific disease. So they did have ways of dealing with this. Now, we can understand, however, that not having the kind of specificity of being able to look at a particular thing, the virus that causes chickenpox, for example, that they couldn't classify diseases as having causative agents in the same way, but what they did is they could classify diseases in other ways. Now, diseases are not all caused by pathogens. So, for example, we could look at the modern system and classify the diseases what we might call structural, physiological, or pathogenic. Now, an example of a structural situation is something like spina bifida. It's considered a congenital condition because it occurs when the spinal column does not close properly, and that results in a whole series of structural changes that reverberate through the person's life. This is not a pathogenic disease. It's a structural issue. If you look at something like congestive heart failure, this is what we could call physiological. What happens with this, we could call it a complex of issues that relate to both the heart and the kidney, where there is a difficulty getting enough flow through the kidneys for the kidneys to be able to filter properly. So the heart it becomes enlarged in the process of trying to up the flow rate. And what you get is what we call a positive feedback loop, where you get a little bit of improvement, but then the heart tries harder and so forth. And then we have the pathogenic ones. And COVID is the one that we're all talking about these days. But of course, there are a ton of other viruses, bacteria, and other pathogens that are larger than those. So these classification categories were not really developed for astrological purposes, but we can approach them indirectly. So if we take these different categories, we can look at them separately from an astrological standpoint. The idea of what we would now call congenital or genetic was known. It was known under a rather archaic word, and the word was husbandry. This was the fact that for millennia now, human beings have been changing the genetic structure of crops and the genetic structure of animals that were of interest to us for whatever purposes. The animal breeding, and I should add here plant breeding, recognized that offspring share traits of their parents. And so selective breeding could embed particular traits within the population. Now, these days, we would do gene, we would be looking at the genes. You can talk about particular variants of the genes. You can talk about sections of genetic code that will represent a particular condition. But certainly the idea that this was inbred, as you would have said, was a completely reasonable position in the 17th century of astrologer William Lilly. It's just they didn't have a mechanism for it that was spelled out the way that it was later spelled out through genetics. Now, almost all sources within the astrological literature identify Saturn as the ruler of husbandry, and here are some of the sources that give that. So we have to assume that this idea of congenital conditions, whether it's disease or whether it's a desired trait, come down to us through Saturn. It's not clear that the ancients would have classified all of what we would now call congenital diseases as such, and not as being of a different type entirely. But the use of the sixth house for disease is general and would have applied to any condition that people classified as disease, whatever its cause, because that was the general house of disease. Now, of course, there's this whole issue that I alluded to, which is what exactly is a disease. We tend to look at clusters of symptoms now and call the disease, whether we call the disease COVID, whether we call the disease spina bifida, whether we call the disease pleurisy. Any of these would have a particular set of conditions, and the tendency of modern medicine is to then further subdivide them according to either cause, if it happens to be an organism, or in terms of structural changes that would be useful in terms of how they would then come up with some kind of care basis or pharmaceutical for that disease. In the astrological system, there was much less of a causation concern that there is now, but the planetary rulership would tell you at least where you could go with it in terms of whatever chart you were going to examine. Now, the sixth house is the primary rulership for disease, with the 12th house applied to very specific types, as Gadbury would say, the long and tedious types. Saunders talked about sinews, okay, which you can kind of get as a Saturn, possibly Jupiter effect, but most diseases were classified by planet. In addition to that, the fifth house could be used to study any of the issues related to what we would generally call the digestion